You're listening to the Paul Young Podcast.
Hello, everybody, wherever you might be. This is the Paul Young Podcast, and welcome. So, in the last couple of weeks, I've been to some funerals, or been directly or indirectly involved in some funerals. Kim and I have a friend, Joanne Petrie. Was Joanne Smith when I first knew her, which was before Kim and I were married, so that's more than 45 years. Joanne and I have become really great friends over the years. Joanne was a hospice chaplain, or is a hospice chaplain, is a grief counselor, is a brilliant human being. She and I do this widows gathering every Christmas. I've done it now, except for a COVID experience. I have done it now for, I think, 10 or 11 years in a row. Every Christmas, I get to go talk to a group of widows. It's one of my favorite things in the world, and I wouldn't miss it. Joanne's husband passed away in the last couple weeks. Funerals are such interesting events. A lot of it is pomp and circumstance, and I'm not a big fan of that. I'm also of the opinion that lies should be never told at funerals. And many funerals, they're not. They're very real. They're very present to those who are there. And oftentimes there needs to be an insert of real humanity, because this is a big deal. Someone's absence, the creation of a space that those who love them need now to build their lives around, because there's nobody that can replace or fill that space. And so it's about learning to embrace the space and continue to move on, which I think is what most those who have passed on or jumped the twig, as they say in the UK, most of those would want us to continue to move on. So this was a remarkable funeral. This is, if you could have this, it's in my top 5 funerals I've ever been at. It was for Ron. Joanne's, I think, 87, I think now. I'm just turning 70, so she's quite my senior. But my aunt, Gladys, is 104. So, we're just kids. There's an excerpt from a little something that Ron Petrie wrote it was a boy called Ron. And this is just a tiny excerpt that was used as his bio in the bulletin that we were handed. And he writes this: "As I think back on my life, I'm struck by the changes in direction and the return to central focus, teaching. I started out in 1956 at St. Paul, teaching 7th and 8th graders, and 61 years later, that is 2017, ended up tutoring 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders in the Smart Reading program. But the question is, why did I have this focus in my life? Why not business, a restaurant, the military, or homesteading in Alaska? Teachers were the people I looked up to, from Mrs. Callahan in the 1st grade and Cicero to Henry Tietz and Dennis Barron at Oregon College of Education and Oregon State University. They encouraged me. They were role models. As I assumed various roles, I tried to be role models for others under my tutelage. In Upward Bound and the Teacher Corps and Head Start and Migrant Education, lives were directly affected, and the process carried over to training teachers at Portland State University. Ron was the head of the education department at PSU. I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I hope I did. So we were there for Ron's funeral, and it was good, but when Joanne got up and spoke, it became great. And Joanne talked about their relationship and how they met. Ron's first wife had passed away, and somebody recommended that he go to this grief class being taught by this woman named Joanne. And so Ron thought he might learn something, and he's in education, and he loves to learn. So he decides, I may get something out of this. So he goes to the class. And after a few of the sessions, he starts coming early because he had a lot of questions for Joanne. And Joanne, how would I describe Joanne? She is, I would say, an Enneagram 7 with more life than all the solar power in the United States put into one person. Like she said to me just at the funeral, I think she said, I'm never going to stop. And I think that she's right. She's just going to run out of gas and be one of those people who falls asleep in the middle of the night and that's it, slips through the barrier. So Joanne steps up and she said, all right, this is how we met. And she starts telling the story about how Ron showed up at her class. One day, Ron tells her about he has a Christmas tree farm out in a place called S2E38 near Portland, Oregon. And Joanne says, hey, Ron, I'm going to go out and see a patient out in S2E38. Can I come by and see the Christmas tree farm? And he says, sure, that would be great. On one condition, that we go get something to eat first together. And she said, okay. So they did, and then Ron drove her around in his red pickup truck around the Christmas tree farm and showed her around. I think it was at the end of that event, being trucked around the Christmas tree farm, that Joanne says, hey, Ron, I heard that you are beginning to date again, and I would like to throw my name into the hat. That should give you a little sense of Joanne. He laughs. A couple of days later, he calls her up and says, are you serious about this? And she said, yes. And so they started dating. Well, they got married. And since they have been married, I have to remember the right number. I think they've been on 27 cruises together. Now, she's telling all of this at the funeral. And she said the main reason that they went on these cruises was to dance together. Because Ron loved to dance and Joanne loved to dance. And so they would go on these cruises to just be in this environment that they could have fun and dance together. And she said, there are these people that are on these cruises. And if you go to the dance floor, they are like perfect. They are there to show you what it's like when real dancers get on the floor. They're dressed properly. They have their turns proper. Everything is absolutely perfect. She said, Ron and I were not that. She said, but they loved to do it. So they did. Their favorite song that they danced to was Elvira. Elvira. You know that song? My heart's on fire. That one. They would love to dance to that song. And they would regularly do it. Well, they always did it when they went somewhere where somebody would play it. So as Ron became more and more disabled and entered into hospice, which is an area that Joanne knows very well, he couldn't walk anymore. It got to the place where he couldn't walk, and so they would dance. And she had a video of her and Ron dancing, him sitting, and so he would use his hands, so spin her around with his hands. He's a very large man and tall, so he could use his hands, spin her around as they both sang, and he did the best he could singing Elvira. So beautiful and so human. Then things got magnificent. Is that the right word? And she said, I have a confession to make and I need your help. I need to have closure about something. So I need your help. And I'm sitting there listening to her wondering, what is this? And she said, Ron and I always in the evenings, we would pray together. We would pray for the family, for those we loved, for what things were on our heart, for any struggles. We would pray together. And at the end of our prayer, we always did this one thing. We would sing the amen, 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 amen. She said we would always sing that together. It got to the point, there were 4 nights in a row, and 3 nights, Ron couldn't speak. He had completely lost his capacity to speak. And they would pray together, and Joanne would do the praying, and Ron would squeeze her hand just to let her know how much he loved her. And she said the 4th night, the squeezing of the hands became so strong. And she knew that 4th night that this was the last time that they would be praying together. And the 3 previous nights, she said, I sang the amen, and I know that he in his heart was singing the amen. But this 4th night, she said, he's squeezing her hand so tightly. And she said, I get one amen out and I completely fall apart. And I just lean into his shoulder and I cry and I cry and I cry and I sob. But I couldn't get the amens out. And she turns to us and says, so would you all help me get some closure? Would you sing the last amens? Would you sing amen with me? And we did. And I watched as mostly women stood up and a few of us men, because it was such a holy moment where we got to help Joanne complete that part of her life and sing amen all the way through. And it was done. It was finished. That's a good funeral. That's a celebration of life. No aggrandizement, no telling us about great successes or anything else. I mean, we were told about who he was and what he accomplished and those kinds of things. But the real part of this funeral were the amens, was the closing. In fact, it wasn't the end of the service, but at that point I got up and I walked out because I didn't want, as beautiful as it could have been, I didn't want someone to stand up and give a sermon after that. I couldn't stay there for that. It was too precious and tangible, and I needed to hold on to it. I am so grateful that I got to be a part of that service, and I got to hug her, and we got to tell each other how much we loved each other and how much I was glad to be there, and Joanne was glad that I was there. Amen. Amen.